Chapter 22. Die? I whispered. He must be struck down at the funeral banquet, she went on as though she hadn't heard me. That way everyone will know that he took the throne wrongfully, and that it is not God's will that he rule. I will do it myself. This hand will strike him down with a dagger as he feasts on what should be yours. She raised her trembling right hand in the air, fingers curled as though clutching a knife. I crept to the door and looked out to make sure that no one was listening. The corridor was empty, save for the guards standing at the far end. You can't, I said, turning to face my mother. You will be executed, probably blinded and tortured first. I don't care, she said. There is no reason for me to live. The witch and her familiar will torture me anyway, just by being alive and ruling the empire that should be yours and mine. Silently, I agreed with her. The mere presence of John on the throne doing everything Anna Dalasena told him would be intolerable. Only by John's death would life be made bearable again. I pictured myself on the throne, the gold ring on my finger, the crown on my head. I pictured my grandmother prostrate at my feet, begging for mercy, which I would refuse to grant. I saw my mother restored to her high place at banquets. But if she were caught and executed, I would take no joy in my rule. I looked at her thoughtfully. She was trembling, and her hands were roaming shakily through her hair, as though looking for the tresses she had flung on the floor in my father's death room. I made a decision. No, Mother, I said. I will do it. She clutched me eagerly. You will? You could? How will you do it? Never mind, I said, but I will take care not to be found out. Now, return to your room before anyone comes in and accuses us of conspiracy. Rightly accuses us, I thought. She nodded. Her lips, as they pressed on my forehead, were hard and cold. I knew what I had to do. Even as I thought this, Sophia entered the room. She looked exhausted, but I took no pity on her. Find Simon, I said. Find Simon immediately, and tell him he must come here. After you have delivered this message, find me a dress such as the kitchen women wear. Obedience was by now such a habit with her that she had already started for the door without questioning me. And Sophia, she turned. Tell Simon he must bring the flask. You know which flask I mean. She hesitated and seemed about to say something, but instead went out the door. I paced up and down, waiting impatiently. I had no clear plan in mind, but one was starting to form. After what seemed an eternity, Simon appeared. He put his bald head in at the door and looked around, obviously uncomfortable at the thought of entering my bedchamber. I seized his arm and dragged him in. Did you bring it? I whispered, after making sure that there was no one in earshot. He nodded, pulling the flask from his sleeve. Give it to me, I commanded, grabbing at his hand, but he evaded my grasp. What do you want it for? He asked. I do not have to explain my actions to you, slave, I said, and saw him wince as the blow hit home. But I had no time to waste on pity, for at that instant Sophia entered, carrying a plain brown shift and wooden shoes. You may leave, I said to Simon. You may not tell anyone what you have seen or done today. Still silent, Simon bowed and went to the door. As Sophia had done earlier, he hesitated. Well, I said, impatient to get on with it. He looked at me, his round face pale. Little beetle, he began. Stop calling me that, I said. He bowed once more. Your Majesty, Princess Anna, he said, his voice quivering. Think before you act. Remember Atreus. Remember Agamemnon. They are dead, I said. I cannot change the past, but I can change the present. Now leave me before someone comes. He stood for a moment longer, then went through the door. His footsteps receded down the corridor. Dress me, I commanded Sophia. Her hands trembled as she did so, and she slid the heavy shoes onto my feet. I pulled the brown hood up over my head. Hand me a mirror, I said. Sophia gave me a heavy bronze hand mirror, and I examined myself. No one would know me in that disguise. Go to my mother's apartments, I instructed Sophia. Tell her not to worry. Tell her that by tonight we will be free. Suddenly Sophia was on the floor, clutching my ankles with both her hands. Princess, she was sobbing, you can't do this. You will be caught and tortured and executed. I will not be caught, I said. I am much more intelligent than that thing that calls itself the Emperor. He will never find out. But you can't kill your own brother, she wailed. It is against nature and the laws of your God. Your God will punish you. So you expect his guardian angel to look out for him? I asked. I would have laughed if I hadn't been in such haste. Don't believe fairy stories, Sophia. Now let go of me. She did not, and I had to bend down and loosen her hands from around my ankles. Leaving her crying on the floor, I slipped out the door and made my way down the corridor. Empty a few minutes before, it was now filled with servants. Some going to their masters' and mistresses' bedrooms to robe them for the feast, others hastening to the kitchen and the banquet hall to make final preparations for that evening. I kept close to the wall, head down, trying to imitate the walk of the slaves. It proved easier than I had thought, since the wooden shoes made it difficult to take long steps. At the door leading out of the section of the palace where the bedchambers were, I saw 2 guards. One of them was the man who had been ordered to keep me out of the library. I was suddenly afraid he would recognize my face, even with the hood over my head. I pulled back into the shadows. After counting to 100, I looked out again. He was still there. Time was running short. I had to enter the banquet hall before the guests arrived, so I decided to fetch Sophia and have her distract the guard while I slipped past. Retracing my steps, I returned to my bedchamber, but the room was empty. Now what? I pulled my courage together and went out into the corridor again. Once more, I made my way down the hall, and as I neared the guard, I saw he had been pressed into carrying a wooden bench into the kitchen. Taking advantage of his absence, I entered the banquet hall. No one was about. Final preparations had been made, and the servants must have been in the kitchen helping to get the food and drink in order. I walked as quietly as I could across the great hall. Tapestries glowed on the wall. The floor had been polished until it gleamed, and my wooden shoes slid on it until I was afraid I would fall. All was in readiness at the long tables, too. The bronze dishes, which I had last seen at my betrothal feast, were shining on the white cloths. Bread was already laid out, and artful arrangements of fruit on every table added color. The goblets were in place, and the servants had already poured wine in them. I felt weak with relief. No one would notice a few more drops of dark liquid in one of the cups. Most of the guests would be drinking from bronze cups, while silver was reserved for the imperial family. At the high table, a gold goblet encrusted with gems awaited the emperor. I knew what I had to do. I moved toward the high table, flask in hand. Up a step to the throne I went, moving it back so that I could reach the table. My heart stopped at the squeak the wooden legs made on the marble floor. The smell of cedar rose to my nose, bringing hot tears to my eyes as I remembered how the scent used to cling about my father for hours after he left his seat. My knees felt weak, and I sat on the high seat of the throne to recover. But I couldn't wait. Even as my head swam and I was afraid I would faint for the first time in my life, my hands were busy uncorking the flask. The smell that rose from it was not particularly strong, and I thought I could risk a fairly large dose without its being noticed. I tipped the flask, and the dark liquid splashed into the wine. At that moment, a slight breeze reached me as the tapestry moved. I froze. From behind the tapestry stepped John. With him was Anna Dalasena, her face so bright with triumph that I could not bear to look at it. John's face mirrored hers. I could not move. Another tapestry shook, and from behind it came 4 guards, swords drawn, faces grim. "Seize her," said John. As they moved in my direction, he added, his voice thick with gloating, "I hope you are comfortable. That is the last time you will ever sit on that throne."